computer speakers. All participant lines are muted. Note the engagement icons on the left side of your screen. A copy of today's presentation is available in the handout section. To ask a question, enter it in the Q&A.
Welcome to Healthcare and Pharmaceutical Industry Business Licensing Live webinar that is taking place on October 19, 2022. Our presenters today are Hans Hawk, Manager Content Management, and David Yount, Vice President of Business Licenses. It is now my pleasure to hand it over to Hans Hawk. Welcome, Hans.
Thanks, Aisha, and welcome as always. Thanks everyone for joining this webinar presented by Wolters Kluwer CT Corporation, titled Healthcare and Pharmaceutical Industry Business Licensing, Key Business License Compliance Areas for the Drug Lifecycle. My name is Hans Hauck. As Aisha mentioned, I am Manager of Content Management for CT Corporation's Business Licensing Group. I've been a legal researcher specifying in business law for nearly 10 years, during which time my focus has often been centered around pharmaceutical business licensing. At one point or another, I've probably researched every question related to pharmacy or wholesale drug distributor licensing that you can think of. But the way laws and regulations change, there's always something new. And to that end, my team and I publish a quarterly digest called TRACK, which stands for Tracking Regulation and Compliance, that analyzes those kinds of changes. So I'm frequently swimming around in pharma legislation. With this webinar, we wanted to show a bird's eye overview of the drug supply chain and the various business types that make up the stages along the chain, how they're licensed and regulated, both federally and at the state level, and provide some insight into changing legislation and the future of the legal landscape of this business realm. A couple of housekeeping points that Aisha mentioned before we dive in that I'll reiterate. There will be a couple of survey questions at the end of the presentation related to your overall satisfaction and the effectiveness of the presentation. So please, if you would, stick around to answer those. So let's get started. So let's start with a quick outline of what we're going to be talking about today. First, we're going to take a look at the drug supply chain, what it is, how it's structured from manufacture of a drug all the way down to retail purchase by the end user. Then we're going to focus in on some of the most important and regulated stages of the drug supply chain to examine what they are and how they fit into the chain. And as this is a business licensing webinar, we're also going to go into the various licensing and registration requirements that exist for businesses at each one of the stages in the chain. And later and throughout the webinar, we'll go into some recent compliance changes, developments and trends that are occurring as a result of current events. And then finally, we'll wrap up the webinar with a discussion with VP and Head of Business Licensing for CT Corporation, David Yount, regarding the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, which is being implemented as we speak, and which will have a lot of repercussions on licensing and regulation in the pharma and life sciences industries. David is an attorney, so getting his insight into this act will be super valuable and a good way to wrap up our presentation. Okay, so let's start with a high-level overview of the drug supply chain. And by the way, what is the drug supply chain? It's the structure of stages by which a human drug progresses from the point of its creation to its ultimate destination of being purchased and consumed by a person. And different sources will list different numbers of steps in the chain, or they'll categorize the steps more broadly, but the concept remains the same. Now, it's worthy to note that my graphic of the drug supply chain you see here is business-centered, and it shows some of the major regulated steps along the chain, but it's not all-inclusive. There are other steps and processes that exist along the chain, some of which we'll mention as we go into each stage here, and some, like insurance approval and drug coverage and pharmacy benefit managers, that we won't. But again, these are the major regulated steps along the drug supply chain. So we begin with manufacture there on the left, obviously the point of creation of a pharmaceutical product. And by the way, during our examination of manufacture, we'll also talk a little bit about the federal drug approval process. So you can slot that into that first step as well. Then we have import and export. So importing drugs from foreign manufacturers or exporting drugs to foreign distributors or other entities. We'll talk about that process and what needs to occur in the US and outside of the US in order for a product to cross national borders. Next, we have repackaging or relabeling. So a manufactured drug might be repackaged to present as whichever distributor brand will ultimately be dispensing it, or relabeled to show a specific pharmacy's formatting or branding. And we'll also touch on some of the more niche business types in that step. Then we have third-party logistics providers. These are the coordinators of shipping, warehousing, and setting up the various ground-level nitty-gritty supply chain logistics for the drug product. Then the wholesale drug distributors, so those entities which receive the manufactured drug product and actually sell and distribute it at wholesale to hospitals, pharmacies, clinics, or other facilities. And then finally, the retail or mail order pharmacies, which fulfill prescription orders and sell the drug product to consumers like you and me. One more quick note here. The steps aren't necessarily in chronological order either. I mean, some are. Obviously, the product manufacturer must come before it can be distributed, but some of them, like repackaging and relabeling, might actually come before import and export, for example. So just something to keep in mind. So let's begin with the first step in the drug supply chain, the manufacture of the drug product. Every drug begins as a twinkle in the eye of a pharmaceutical scientist. Just wanted to say that. I don't know why. Actually, though, the decision on whether to develop a certain type of drug usually centers around funding. So early on, it's typically government funding or philanthropic funding that feeds research and development, focusing on treating or curing a certain disease or what have you. Once initial R&D gets off the ground, later funding for the creation of a drug product often comes from pharmaceutical companies or venture capitalists. Now, before any large-scale manufacture can begin on a new drug product, the drug must obtain approval from the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. And that process is probably something we're all a little more familiar with following the vaccine race in 2020 and all that came with that. But in a nutshell, the drug approval process goes like this. Before being submitted to the FDA, the new drug gets tested by independent clinical labs, which, by the way, are heavily regulated and licensed in their own regard. And if the testing lives up to the FDA's standards and the drug is shown to be safe and of some use, the results will be sent to the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, the CDER, which is the FDA's drug approval arm, where analysis will be conducted on the product's chemical properties, its proposed use and labeling, and the data from the testing period. And the CDER will either approve or reject the drug. The CDER, by the way, is made up, as you would imagine, of pharmaceutical scientists, physicians, and other doctors. Now, the FDA quotes its standard time frame for drug approval to be about 10 months, but that can and usually does stretch out to be longer. They do hold priority reviews, as they did with the COVID vaccines, which can decrease the drug approval period for drugs that are, critical or of some kind of pressing national health interest. Okay, so assuming FDA approval was granted, large-scale manufacturing can begin. Now, manufacturers themselves are federally regulated, so whether they're producing prescription drug products and controlled substances or over-the-counter products, medical devices, or even supplements and vitamins, they'll need to be federally registered. And by that, I mean that manufacturers need to register their facility where the production takes place, as well as the products themselves with the FDA. For registering the facility, this usually entails a basic registration application. And for the drug products, it usually requires the submittal of samples of product labels and drug details for any commercially listed products. The FDA maintains all of this registration information in a searchable online database called the Drug Establishment's Current Registration Site for the facilities and the Electronic Drug Registration and Listing System for the individual products. So that's federal. At the state level, manufacturers are required to be licensed in the state in which they maintain a center of production, and usually in whatever state they plan to distribute to as well. Licensing is typically handled by the State Board of Pharmacy and involves an application process where the facility submits its layout and plans, undergoes a state inspection, provides details about the products it's manufacturing, and oftentimes owners and officers undergo a background check. Once licensed, the manufacturer can proceed with operations as long as it continues to renew its license and comply with ongoing inspections and board notification requirements. Now, some of you may have heard of a virtual manufacturer or an own label or a private label manufacturer. These are entities which don't actually manufacture a product themselves, but they act as if they do through a contractual agreement with an actual manufacturer. So basically, they'll pay a third-party manufacturer to affix their branding and label onto a product and then retail it as if it were their own. Licensing for these kind of business types is variable, with some states having specific licenses dedicated to them and other states slotting them into regular old manufacturer or wholesale drug distributor licenses. So let's talk about importing and exporting human drug products. As you can imagine, this is one of the most highly regulated areas of the drug supply chain, at least at the federal level, with detailed records required for every single product shipment being exchanged across national borders. Now, it's generally illegal in the US for an FDA-approved drug to be imported from another country by an individual for their personal use. There are some case-by-case exceptions, but in general, it's not allowed. And this is something that's sort of politically charged, right? I mean, we're always hearing politicians argue for legalizing drug imports from Canada or Mexico in order to manage the cost of drug products, but at this time we haven't seen much movement in that area, so it's still essentially not allowed. But as far as business importing of drugs goes, the first thing that needs to happen is the foreign manufacturer must register both its facility and its products with the FDA, just like a domestic manufacturer would. So just like it does with manufacturers in the US, the FDA inspects foreign manufacturers to make sure they measure up to safety standards. This may be themselves or through a foreign arm. Once registered, the process mainly centers around declarations. So the foreign exporter must declare a specific importer, and the importer can declare the foreign product to import, and the transfer can proceed. There might be specific permits an importer will need based on the type of product they're importing. For instance, a controlled substance import permit from the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA. But for the most part, the bulk of regulations flow through the FDA and customs, depending on the product. And there are a lot of individual filings that need to be executed for each shipment that occurs, especially with customs where packing slips will be analyzed, lots of declaration paperwork. Now, for exporting drugs, we see a lot of the same regulatory hurdles. By the way, some trivia. The biggest exporter of drugs in the world is Germany, followed by Switzerland, Belgium, France, and Italy, and then the US. So just a fun fact there. But for exporting from the US drug manufacturer is going to register with the FDA, as always. And when it wants to export a drug product to a recipient outside of the US, what it will usually do is provide that recipient with a certificate of pharmaceutical product, or CPP, which is a certificate issued by the FDA showing that the facility and the specific product being exported are in compliance with regulations and are generally on the level. And sometimes the FDA can even go a step further and issue what's called a CGMP letter. That's a current good manufacturing practice letter, which is just a further assurance that the FDA has vetted and double-checked the exporter's facilities to make sure they're legitimate and up to snuff. Once everything checks out, the exporter obtains the product-specific export certificate from the FDA, as well as any needed permits, for instance, a controlled substance export permit from the DEA for controlled substance exports. Okay, moving on to repackagers and relabelers. Now, repackaging a drug is what it sounds like, taking it from its original manufacturer packaging and placing it into a different container without manipulating it itself in any way. Often this is done for marketing reasons, so that the brand name drug can be packaged and sold as such, but it's also done for dividing large quantities of product into smaller packages for distribution and other more practical reasons. Relabeling is changing the drug product's label in some way for whatever reason. So pretty self-explanatory there. And the first thing I'll note is that the FDA is generally going to require registration for businesses engaging in any kind of operation in which the packaging, labeling, or the product itself is changed in some way. So while wholesalers of drug products who are simply buying inventory and selling it might not need to register their facility with the FDA, repackagers and relabelers must do so because they're changing the package, they're changing what you get. And this is really the FDA making sure that for something as health sensitive as a human drug, they try to maintain as much of a regulatory structure around it as possible so that the product sold to the end consumer has minimal variation from the product as it was initially approved and certified. So repackagers and relabelers will register as establishments with the FDA, and like manufacturers, they'll also have to register the individual drug products they're working with as well. And there are strict chain of custody regulations, especially now, related to repackaging products, and these types of businesses are required to keep repackaging logs. We'll talk about that when we talk about the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, but there are some pretty precise guidelines about what must be included on a new product label, for instance, for a relabeler, what can't be included on that product's label, and other particulars in that regard. In addition to federal registration, a state license for repackagers and relabelers is usually required. This might be a specific license unto itself, but it's most often wrapped up under a more general overarching license like manufacturer, wholesale drug distributor, or pharmacy license. Some states will even have a license requirement for the warehousing of drugs generally, and sometimes repackagers and relabelers might fall under that warehouse license, while other states might specifically declare that this particular license is required for anyone repackaging or relabeling a drug product. So they'll have a very specific repackager license. And you'll see there the steps to get licensed as a repackager or relabeler business are similar to manufacturers and are in turn similar to other entity types further on down the chain. So an application with an inspection of the warehouse or facility where the regulated activity takes place, a background check for owners or key officers, and often submission of contract samples and facility plans are all required in order to become licensed. Now in this slide on the right there, I've included some other business types that require FDA registration and are sort of akin to repackagers and relabelers, at least when it comes to the level of federal oversight they accrue. So contract sterilizers, for instance, are businesses that provide sterilization and cleaning services for FDA-regulated products like medical devices, usually via a contract with a manufacturer or distributor. There are remanufacturers. These are entities that do any sort of refurbishing, restoring, or really anything that alters a medical device's performance in some way. Again, we talk about FDA oversight into anything that might change the product, right? And then specification developer is exactly what it sounds like. They don't do any manufacturing, but they do develop specifications for medical devices and other products, and they do need to be registered with the FDA. Next up are third-party logistics providers. These are business entities that coordinate things like shipping schedules for movement of drug product, coordinate warehousing or temporary storage, inventory management, fulfillment, really anything that falls into the realm of supply chain logistics without actually taking title or ownership of the product itself. And that's an important part of most statutes referencing 3PLs. Never is the title or ownership of the product in the name of the 3PL. They never own it, or else they wouldn't be a 3PL or they'd require additional licensing of some kind. Now, 3PLs really only coordinate and move the product, as I said. They don't open packages. They certainly don't repackage. They don't store the product for long periods of time, at least. They're solely involved in, again, logistics. And actually, 3PLs aren't exclusive to the pharma industry. Any number of businesses with products that require large-scale distribution can utilize a third-party logistics provider. FedEx is a 3PL, DHL also, so not specific to the pharma industry. But for our purposes, 3PLs involved with the drug supply chain are what we're talking about. Now, they aren't at this time required to register their businesses federally with the FDA like manufacturers or repackagers and relabelers. But in accordance with the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, which again we're going to talk about a little later, they are required to make annual reports to the FDA showing that they are duly licensed in whatever states require them to be licensed. And these reports get published in a searchable government database as well. And the FDA requires this partially for their own information and regulatory compliance measures, but also for all interested parties within the drug supply chain. It's becoming an increasingly important requirement that a pharmaceutical business does its own due diligence to research and vet a potential business partner to ensure that they're contracting with a licensed and legal entity. And these 3PL licensure reports assist businesses in doing that. Now, to actually move to the state level, 3PLs are required to be licensed in most states. There are a handful of states that don't require licensure. At the time of this webinar, I believe Idaho, Maine, New Jersey, Massachusetts, if you're a non-resident, you don't need a license. But most states have some sort of licensing requirement for third-party logistics providers. About 2/3 of states, 3/4 maybe. Whether it's a specific 3PL license or like some other business activities we discussed, it might fall under some other licenses umbrella, most commonly the wholesale drug distributor license. Licensure for 3PLs is going to require an application process, usually with the State Board of Pharmacy, wherein any warehouses or actual brick and mortar facilities are inspected by the state in which those structures are located. Most likely background checks for owners and key officers. 3PLs might have to provide samples of contracts that they'll utilize when contracting with their clients, and they'll need to show evidence that they're licensed and legal in their home state. Now, I mentioned the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. Again, I don't want to get too much into it right now since we'll be discussing it in a bit with David, but I will just say that 3PLs are becoming increasingly regulated as the act becomes more solidified. Okay, so now we're getting into the real product sales-oriented business types, namely the wholesale drug distributors and pharmacies. And wholesale drug distributors, these are entities that receive drug product from the manufacturer or other entity and sell it at wholesale to facilities like hospitals, pharmacies, clinics, and sometimes other distributors. And I've been mentioning wholesale drug distributors throughout the presentation because the wholesale drug license, it's sort of the base foundational license type for so many other business types that might not otherwise have their own specific license. So manufacturers, 3PLs, repackagers and relabelers, virtual manufacturers, reverse distributors. These are all business types that might need to obtain a wholesale drug license depending on the state. Reverse distributors, by the way, they're entities that collect drug product from facilities and move it somewhere else, usually for recycling or disposal purposes. So that's a reverse distributor. Now, federally, like 3PLs, wholesale drug distributors aren't generally required to register as regulated facilities with the FDA, obviously unless they're also engaging in a more regulated activity. But they are required, like 3PLs, to make annual reports of their licensure status in any states in which they operate. At the state level, wholesale drug distributors are required to be licensed in the state where they're headquartered, as well as any states in which they distribute a drug product. So once they've undergone inspection and licensing in their home state, they'll be asked to provide evidence of the home state licensure in the states in which they apply as non-residents. Now, licensure itself consists of an application with a facility inspection, background check, and fingerprinting of owners and key officers. I'm going to sound like a broken record here. Showing proof of responsibility financially and certain insurance requirements as well. Some states require that wholesale drug distributors also obtain certain national accreditations. A big one is the accreditation issued by the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy, the NABP. It used to be called a VAUD accreditation, but it has since changed its name. And then one sort of unique requirement of wholesale drug distributors is the appointment of what's called a designated representative. Some other business types have this requirement as well, but it's a requirement for all wholesale drug distributors, regardless of the state. And the designated representative is an employee, it's an individual employed by the business who has some experience in the life sciences realm. So maybe they've taken the required courses or hold the requisite experience. But the designated rep is supposed to be the person who can oversee operations, has some knowledge of what's considered compliant, with state and national standards, and can answer for the business on an industry level. And depending on the state, the designated representative either needs to be designated on the business's license application or they may even need to pass exams and obtain their own individual license. And then finally, of course, if the drug product being sold is considered a controlled substance, there might be a requirement for the distributor to register with the DEA. Once licensed, again, as long as the wholesale drug distributor continues to renew their license, maintains the proper compliance, files their annual reports, and reports any changes in business to the relevant board, they can continue to operate legally. And now we come to the last stage of the drug supply chain, the retail pharmacies. And these might be your local brick and mortar pharmacy like Walgreens or CVS or Happy Harry's if you grew up in Delaware like me. Shout out to Happy Harry's. I think they are actually defunct now. Or these might be online or mail order remote pharmacies, which are becoming more and more numerous and which might not have a physical presence in a state, but which do dispense drugs into the state. Now, either way, pharmacies, by definition, as you probably know, sell drug product at retail to consumers, either over the counter or pursuant to a prescription. As far as regulation, there aren't a ton of federal registration requirements related to retail pharmacies, aside from controlled substance registration with the DEA. And obviously, pharmacies must adhere to national standards of good practices, and occasionally federal inspections might occur in certain circumstances and for certain activities, but most pharmacy regulation occurs at the state level. And there's a lot that goes into it. So first and foremost, pharmacies will need to submit an application and undergo inspection, either of their brick and mortar facility or of their office or storage facility if they're a non-resident. Owners and officers will undergo fingerprinting and background checks once again. The pharmacy might need to submit samples of the labels it will affix to a prescription drug product. It might need to show proof of relevant insurance requirements, submit a floor plan or a site layout of the facility, and show proof of licensure in its home state if it's applying as a non-resident, and sometimes proof of licensure with other non-resident states as well. Now, if the pharmacy will engage in what's called sterile compounding, which is basically altering drug products in order to prepare custom medications for patients in a sterile environment, then there might be some additional hoops they'll need to jump through as well, mainly consisting of more strenuous inspections and potential accreditation requirements for sterile compounding. Most states require pharmacies to employ a licensed pharmacist in charge, or sometimes called a pharmacy manager. And some states actually have both pharmacist in charge and pharmacy manager requirements. And this is similar to the designated representative requirement for the wholesale drug distributors. But it's an individual who is licensed as a pharmacist and is responsible for overseeing pharmaceutical operations and answering to the board for any wrongdoing or compliance issues on behalf of the pharmacy. Now, for pharmacies applying as non-residents, remote mail order pharmacies, states are increasingly beginning to require that the pharmacy employ at least one pharmacist on staff who holds a license in that state. So in Nevada, for instance, even if your pharmacy has no physical presence in the state whatsoever, if you want to obtain a license to dispense drugs to patients in Nevada, you must employ a Nevada licensed pharmacist on your staff. So again, not all states have that kind of requirement, but we have seen an increasing number of states that are implementing it. A couple of other requirements there. All states now have some form of a prescription drug monitoring program, or PDMP. And this is an electronic system of records that shows any time a controlled substance was prescribed and dispensed to a patient. And PDMPs were developed in big part to help combat the opioid crisis by allowing prescribers and pharmacies to see data on how many times a certain patient has been prescribed a controlled substance, to help prevent patients from going to different doctors and pharmacies in order to obtain more and more prescription drugs. So pharmacies are required to submit monthly electronic PDMP reports to their state's PDMP database. And then the last one there, some states do have their own healthcare systems in place with which the pharmacy may need to register in order to become licensed. And then also, while we're here at this retail level, there are some license types that we haven't mentioned that are akin to pharmacy licenses, but they may exist for specific product types. For instance, the durable medical equipment license for retail sales of medical devices, medical gas licenses for sales of medical oxygen and other gases, and some states even have licenses for dispensing specific types of drugs. There are also outsourcing facility licenses for entities engaged in third-party compounding on behalf of other pharmacy businesses. So, there are numerous other specifically regulated activities, and there really just isn't time to go into every one of them. By the way, though, if you're interested in durable medical equipment regulation, I did present a webinar specific to that subject. You can find it on the Walter Schooler website, so check that out. And I'm sure we'll do some more business-specific webinars in the future. Now, it's important to note that regulations surrounding pharmacies are always changing. Excuse me, always changing. And especially recently, following the pandemic, industries like telepharmacy, for instance, are becoming more regulated as we begin to utilize tech to accomplish things that used to require in-person meetings. It seems like every year a major legislative trend begins to take shape, and state legislatures will pass new laws all the time. So just something to be aware of, especially in an industry as regulated as retail pharmacy. Okay, so that was the chain. The last topic I want to cover here is some non-compliance pitfalls. Excuse me while I grab a drink of water here. And by non-compliance pitfalls, I mean some general areas relevant to all business types within the drug supply chain, wherein extra attention or monitoring is key in remaining legal and compliant as a business, right? And the first is renewals. So every business is going to be required to renew their licenses, whether on an annual, biennial, or other periodic basis. So keep track of your license renewal dates because they won't all be the same. And have some kind of a system in place for managing your renewals so that they don't get out of hand or become delinquent. Also, this webinar has focused primarily on federal and state industry-specific licenses, but don't neglect your general tax registrations like sales tax, payroll tax, and corporate income tax, as well as your local basic business licenses that might be issued by the county or city where you're located. Add it up, your license portfolio for operating a compliant business within the drug supply chain can get pretty large. Next, nearly every business type in the pharmaceutical industry has some sort of reporting requirement, and we mentioned some of them. So whether it's the annual FDA licensure report for 3PLs and wholesalers, the monthly PDMP reporting requirement, these are all strict deadlines. So again, have a system in place for managing those. Next up is change notifications. And this is a big potential pitfall for compliance. Most boards of pharmacy are going to require a business to notify them anytime an aspect of the business changes, even if it's simply an officer leaving and a new officer coming in. And for some bigger changes, like changes of ownership, changes of ownership or the business name changing, those might even require specific filings or even brand new applications. And when you're talking about a business licensed in all 50 states and DC, that's a lot of filing work. And to make it more complicated, different boards have different deadlines for when a report needs to be made. Some might simply require that you update the information during renewal, while others might require that you update within 30 days of the change occurring. Then we have changing legislation amidst world developments. And I spoke about this in the last slide a little more, but laws change all the time. PDMPs, for instance, are relatively new developments, the last 10 years. Standing orders issued by states pursuant to regional or national emergencies happen all the time. There were a bunch during COVID, some of which are still in place. Puerto Rico just began requiring licensure for non-resident wholesale drug distributors and a slew of other pharma business types. All this is to say that the landscape is constantly in flux, so it's important that businesses in whatever category keep their eye on changing legislation. And then finally, just a note on penalties. They can be strict in this industry. So aside from your garden variety fines and late fees, licenses can be revoked in more extreme cases. And one pretty common characteristic of the pharma industry is that boards of pharmacy will actually publish disciplinary actions taken against license holders in their newsletters and on their websites. They'll just put it right out there. So it's important to avoid that kind of publicity. Okay, so that sort of wraps up the slide-by-slide portion of our presentation. And at this time, I'd like to introduce David Yant. As I said, David is Vice President and Head of Business Licenses at Wolters Kluwer's CT Corporation. I've had the pleasure of working with him off and on for nearly a decade now. It's great to have him here to give some insight, to take the pressure off me for a minute and let me get a drink. So thanks for joining, David.
Thank you, Hans, and thank you to everyone that joined the webinar today.
Thanks, Dave. To start off, can you give us a bit of an overview of the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, what it is, when it started?
Sure. Well, the DSCSA is actually Title II of the Drug Quality and Security Act. This law was enacted in November of 2013. I think it was introduced into the House in September of that same year. And actually, you mentioned compounding pharmacy a few slides back. The impetus for the enactment of this law was an event that was traced back to a compounding pharmacy. It was a meningitis outbreak, actually. And unfortunately, 60 to 65 people died throughout multiple states. And so there are two titles of the Act. Title II is the Drug Quality and Security, or DSEA is Title II of the Drug Quality and Security Act. And Title I is the Compounding Quality Act. So the purpose, we're really focused on Title II, and really the purpose of the DSCSA is to establish a tracing of prescription drugs through the supply distribution chain. Title I was focused entirely on the manufacturing of compounding drugs and enhancing regulations and monitoring in that area as a byproduct of the unfortunate meningitis outbreak. And Title II was more broadly focused on tracing prescription drugs through the supply chain, as you've spoken about today. So I think the public policy behind the Drug Quality and Security Act may be obvious, but it is to protect consumers from exposure to drugs that may be counterfeit, stolen, contaminated, or really otherwise harmful, while improving detection and removal protocol of dangerous drugs. So the Act outlines requirements for manufacturers, repackagers, wholesale drug distributors, dispensers, and third-party logistics companies. There has been a phased-in approach since 2014, and we're nearing the conclusion of that, the phasing in of all the various requirements.
Okay, yeah, and it seems like a pretty big sort of legal standardization, right? I mean, how are states handling the regulation prior to this act? How are they handling things?
Well, I think an argument could be made that they really were not handling it, not specific to the monitoring of the supply chain. There is state regulation of the drug supply chain that varies state by state. And this is largely the case, as you've mentioned, with licensing requirements. But the DSCSA standardizes that supply chain so that there is product tracing that is consistent across all of the states. There has been, I think you mentioned the PDMPs, or the prescription drug monitoring programs that were developed by the states. The purpose or the public policy behind those is slightly different and was really focused upon controlled substances. And so the DSCSA really is a law not replacing a previous law, but really enacting regulation where there may have previously been a void. The PDMPs still exist, and and exist for a very valid public policy related to controlled substances and prescriptions of those drugs. But the DSCSA is casting a much wider net.
Yeah, agreed. And what are some specific types of things that businesses are going to need to look out for, some types of regulations being put into place that they can expect as that continues to be implemented?
Well, record keeping and reporting is paramount. Technology obviously allows companies or makes this slightly easier than it may have been 25 to 30 years ago. So the DSCSA standardizes the record keeping process in the event a product changes ownership. That's an element or a regulatory hurdle that companies might incur. Due diligence with respect to authorized trading partners. So is my trading partner legitimate? Are they licensed? Are they compliant? Are they federally authorized? That's another important element. And then regarding labeling requirements, those are more strict through the enactment of this regulation, and does require that every package or case introduced into commerce be marked with a unique identifier or serial number back to the public policy through tracing of these prescription drugs through the entire supply chain.
Okay, so a lot more internal record keeping requirements that they're going to need to comply with, things like that, for sure. Are any businesses, any specific business types going to be more affected maybe than others might be?
Well, I think you've gone over a number of really all of the trading partners in the chain. And so the Act applies to virtually everyone within that chain and defines trading partners as drug manufacturers, repackagers, wholesale drug distributors, and dispensers or pharmacies. Section 205 of the Act proposes a national standardization for licensure of wholesale drug distributors and 3PLs, including standards for inspections and prerequisites for licensure. So while wholesale drug distributor license requirements exist in all states already, 3PLs or the companies operating in the 3PL environment might see an increase in the required license portfolio. For states that do not have 3PL license requirements, the FDA would become the licensing authority. Although, as I know that you're aware, Hans, we have seen increased activity and new regulations around 3PL licensure in a number of states over the last 10 years. Currently, licensed wholesale drug distributors and 3PLs might see a change in the way periodic inspections are conducted, and they might be asked to provide documentation showing compliance with new prerequisite standards. Those are the main areas.
Okay. Now, we mentioned a little bit about penalties during my last slide, but are there penalties baked into the DSCSA as well?
Yes and no. So Section 206 establishes penalties, and specifically the DSCSA modifies federal law USC 331 to include noncompliance with aspects of the DSCA as a prohibited act. So noncompliance equals a prohibited act, and then penalties for prohibited acts are contained in the United States Code. So it does specify penalties for prohibited acts. So I say yes and no only because they're not specifically in the language of the DSCSA, but they would exist for noncompliance. That could include imprisonment or a fine of not more than $1,000, or imprisonment of not more than 3 years, or a fine of not more than $10,000 for subsequent or intentional violations. But also equitable remedies could be the suspension of a business's ability to operate, could be restitution, disgorgement of profits, or product seizure. And then there are also the federal criminal code authorizes a general fine of up to $250,000 for individuals and $500,000 for entities. So I mentioned that we've been in a phased-in approach. There has been a tremendous amount of guidance released by the FDA to allow companies to understand what they would consider to be non-compliance or what is compliance. And so I don't think that there has been yet a lot of activity to look at penalties, but I suspect that there will be. And this is where the guidance would exist, a combination between the United States Code and the DSCSA.
Okay, yeah, certainly not something you want to ignore. Lastly, I'll give you an easy one. How can CT Corporation help businesses comply with the Act as it takes shape and continues to be implemented?
Yeah, thank you, Hans. I think there really are three areas. Continuous compliance is elemental as part of this act. The act is really meant to focus on the chain of custody or the supply chain and labeling, and have a process to ferret out bad drugs, essentially. So we're not specifically dealing with that element, but licensure, continuous licensure and compliance is key. If there's a disciplinary action against a facility or an entity, that must be reported. If it's not reported, then that would probably rise to the level of a prohibited act. So that is what we do as CT Corp, and the business license operation within CT Corp is help businesses understand the license requirements based upon the nature of their business activity. So we can help 3PLs and wholesale drug distributors understand what the burden of licensure is. We can help get those licenses, and we can help maintain those licenses. So I look at this in a sense of removing one element of not just the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, but continuous corporate compliance for businesses that are operating in this field. There is another element to our service that is very specific to the healthcare and life sciences space. It's called TRAC, which is an acronym for Tracking Regulations and Compliance. This is a quarterly survey that you are familiar with, Hans, where we dive deeper into regulatory changes. So in the event that one of the states you mentioned does not today have a requirement for a non-resident pharmacy or packager or wholesale drug distributor to be licensed, we're monitoring the changes as they are moving through the legislative chain. And this product will notify, in part, subscribers that there is either a change coming or a change has occurred. And if your business falls within the parameters of what the change is affecting, then we can notify clients or potential clients or any subscriber of that change, and we can help make sure that the company then becomes compliant. So the TRAC product does a deeper dive into regulatory changes in the healthcare and life sciences space. And then the last element, and we talked about knowing your partner in the supply chain, and whether in part the partner in that supply chain was also properly licensed. And so we conduct vendor verification for different industries, but specifically for the healthcare and life sciences space, where we can take a list of the vendors that a client is dealing with, and we can check the state level licensure and whether that is active or whether a renewal has lapsed. Because remember, companies do have a responsibility to know their partner and to be dealing with legitimately licensed companies in this space.
Yeah, that's baked right into the act there. So, yeah, thanks, David. I really appreciate you joining and providing some insight here. It's super helpful.
Thank you, Hans.
Okay, I think we do have time for a few questions, which is great. So let me see if I can pull some out of the Q&A box there. Let's see. Is there a central resource for monitoring changes in state and federal pharma laws? Central resource, not really. I mean, for federal pharma laws, there is the FDA website, and I believe they have an email subscription as well in which they'll update you about changing legislation. But for states, it's kind of all over the place. Some states will publish periodic newsletters. Others will update their websites with news and changes, but you really have to go into every state's Board of Pharmacy website individually. For legislative developments, there are websites where you can follow state bills as they progress. Like one we use is Bill Track 50. And there is the NABP, the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy. They have a really good email subscription service where they give a lot of updates. But again, on a state-by-state basis, it's really a matter of checking with each state individually. Or there's our track report that Dave mentioned earlier, which does give a breakdown of pharma changes in all 50 states each quarter. So there's that. Let's see what else here. Will PDMPs be phased out now that there are drug tracing requirements within the DSCSA? There's certainly no indication of that. And as David mentioned, a lot of the DSCSA measures are centered around keeping logs and detailed records of drug products internally and providing them whenever a product changes hands. And that's a little different than the purpose of a PDMP, where the dispensing of controlled substances is reported and visible so that other dispensers can check to make sure they aren't dispensing drugs in mass quantities to a patient who's going from pharmacy to pharmacy. So each has its own purpose. And to answer your question, no, I see no indication that states will phase out PDMPs. Do states require licenses? Do many states require licenses for telepharmacy? So it's important to define what you mean by telepharmacy. If you're talking about mail order and online pharmacies where patients can order drug products and have them shipped to their door, yeah, every state requires a license for that sort of business activity. But a lot of times when someone says telepharmacy, they're talking about virtual consultations with a doctor or pharmacist, right? So I mentioned before that things like this used to require in-person visits, but with the growing remoteness that is afforded us by tech, there's been some space cleared for telepharmacy or telehealth. I actually had an appointment with an optometrist via telepharmacy, sort of. So I went to the optometrist's office, I did my various vision tests with the nurses, and then I sat in a room and met with the optometrist via Zoom. And she was able to see all my test results and all that. It was interesting. But to go back to your question, yes, some states do require licenses for businesses or individuals engaged in telepharmacy in that sense, but not many. Florida comes to mind. I believe they have a telehealth license. Florida generally has like a license for almost everything, but not a ton of others. Now, as I said before, things change and new laws are passed all the time. So it is important to check periodically with state boards of pharmacy or other licensing authorities. But at this time, the answer is yes, but not many. All right, I do want to leave a few minutes to answer those Q&A, to answer those survey questions at the end. And so I think that's going to bring us to a close for now. There are some other questions in the Q&A box. I do try to answer those as quickly as possible post-presentation by email. So if I didn't address your question, look for an email from me in the coming few days or a week at the most. But thanks again, everyone, for joining our webinar, Healthcare and Pharmaceutical Industry Business Licensing, Key Business License Compliance Areas for the Drug Life Cycle. As I mentioned before, please stick around for those survey questions. But other than that, enjoy your Wednesday, and I'll turn it back over to Aisha.
Thank you, Hans. And we just have a few evaluation questions before we conclude. The first is, would you like to speak with a CT expert about our business license services? Again, that is, would you like to speak with a CT expert about our business license services? I'll give everyone a few seconds to answer that question before we move on to the second evaluation question. And the next evaluation question is, please rate the value of today's webinar content on a scale from 1 to 5, where 5 is the highest and 1 is the lowest. Again, that is, please rate the value of today's webinar content on a scale from 1 to 5, where 5 is the highest and 1 is the lowest. And I'll give everyone a few seconds to answer that before we move on to our final evaluation question. And our last evaluation question is, please rate today's presenters on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is the highest and 1 is the lowest. Once again, please rate today's presenters on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is the highest and 1 is the lowest. Thank you for providing your feedback and joining today's webinar. This now concludes today's live webcast. You may now disconnect.